This is, I just want to reiterate before we get into our actual conversation that quite often we've been, Jeffrey and I, since I moved here, and he had moved here a little bit earlier, very aware that Atlanta is an entire ecology of offerings within the arts, and there is quite often opportunity for crossover. This is one of those sort of signature sort of moments where we can do that, share audiences, and be able to use the distinctions between the different institutions that we represent and different audiences that we speak to try to sort of open up a dialogue. It's why we made the decision to do a conversation more than a lecture, and it's a really wonderful moment. It's a really important moment, I think, to talk about the fact that this is a real homecoming for Jack Whitten. He left the South in 1960 and moved to New York City. And much of the work that you're looking at is the product of that move. And so it's really great. He's not been back in Atlanta, certainly, since he was a child, really, or a teenager. And so I would just, by giving you a brief biological sketch, Jack grows up in Bessemer, Alabama, went to school at Tuskegee Institute, and then switched to Southern University. After a year at Southern, moved to New York City to attend art school at the Cooper Union, and primarily began his artistic training there and immersed himself in what was in 1960, as you can imagine, a fairly intense community in the Lower East Side of Manhattan with visual artists, writers, political figures, thinkers, and I would venture to say that much of the work that you're going to be looking at was formed by his immersion in that scene, but I'd like to sort of talk, or at least start our conversation by talking about the South and ask you about a little bit about your upbringing in the segregated South and your relationship to what we might call a kind of quote-unquote Southern sensibility.
Big subject, Stuart. Really a big subject. But of course, the South is what forms me. I mean, I'm a great believer in what I call Southern sensibility. The first time I used this term, we did a show at the Mobile Museum on Southern painters. And the curator, I remember, visited the studio at that time, and I used the term Southern sensibility. And he sort of read back in his chair. He says, "What are you talking about?" In literature, we have an understanding of the Southern sensibility, but it's not that evident in the visual arts. But you must remember, here in America, we have some very important artists from the South. Unfortunately, we have just lost Robert Rauschenberg. Unfortunately, a very good example of what I mean by Southern sensibility. We also have Jasper Johns. We have Cy Twombly. There's a lot of artists, visual artists, from the South. So when I speak of Southern sensibility, I have a lot of information to go on. Stuart, you've opened up a can of worms.
That's my job. That's why I came here.
We could be here all night.
Well, I remember the last time, I'm looking at, I see Mark and Judith Taylor. Last time we were all together, we were talking about hunting and fishing.
Oh, yeah.
So why don't we talk a little bit about hunting and fishing in the South and its relationship to paintings?
Briefly, because you get me started on that. We'll definitely be here all night. As kids, we used to make a few extra pennies by hunting raccoons, hunting possums, hunting muskrats. We would take their hides off, tack them to the wall to dry, and we would sell them. I would get like 50 cents, 30 cents. Do you have any idea how that has affected my thinking about materials?
Bring it on. How has it affected your thinking about materials?
When I arrived in New York, in some of the first discourses on the formalities of art, the word plane, P-L-A-N-E, I was taught that the support that we use is known as the picture plane. And I'm thinking, what are you talking about, picture plane? To me, I've skinned raccoons, right? Flat to the wall. That's the plane that I knew. That was a skin. I didn't sell all those things. Sometimes I took them and we did things with them. We experimented with them. We actually drew on them. So the picture plane, in terms of skins, it's directly connected to early things in the South. Things like going over to my mom. My mom was a great, The first time I'd heard the word recycle, it pertains to my mother. Growing up poor in the South, my mom actually bought old clothing from the Salvation Armies, from the Army surplus stores. She would take those clothes and take them apart, rip them apart, deconstruct them, clean them. We had a big pot in the backyard. She would clean them out with something called white gas. And people used that to clean woolens. And she would take those things, dye them, and make them over again. Make a jacket, make a pair of pants. Here is my first experience with recycling in terms of materials. Here is my first example of the collage. And of course we had quilts. I mean, every lady that I knew at church made quilts. I grew up with quilts. So the quilts was one of the big first connections of the handmade things, right? Now, not to say that quilts were not made in other parts of the country. Of course they were. We have some very good examples from Pennsylvania Dutch countries. Lots of examples. But for me, the personal aspect of this has had profound effect upon my thinking in painting, putting things together, the construction of things, the notion of the mosaic, the bits and parts of things that go together to make a whole.
Yeah, that when we show some images for people who have not seen the work, that will become certainly even clearer, this notion of a kind of assemblage, the kind of recycles.
And making.
And making things.
I use the word making a lot.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we'll certainly be talking about today, while the show at the Contemporary, which is called Memorial Paintings, and we'll flush out a little bit for people here what that entails. One of my goals for the evening, and it's partially affecting the nature of what we're going to show you in terms of imagery, is to try to put these memorial paintings into a larger context, because you're looking at someone who's been painting for 40 years as an abstract painter, very aware of what does it mean to make a painting, what are the sort of influences, where does the nature of what Jack does come from. But you mentioned church, and I guess I would like to, before we get too far, certainly I remember a key interest of mine in bringing these memorial paintings here and organizing an exhibition about them was you telling me that your notion of paying tribute came out of your upbringing in the church. And so if you could talk a little bit about the church and its influence.
My first experiences in the Christian fundamentalist church growing up in Bessemer, we had a part of the service that was known as testifying. I'm sure people here in the South can identify with that. It's where one would stand before the congregation and you would talk about what's going on in your life. You would testify, and you would testify and profess your belief in the scriptures. So testifying, okay, it stems with that. As we all know, growing up in the South and survival depended upon, first of all, the institution of the family. Second, the institution of the church. Third, the institution of the community at whole, including the school systems. Without that, we would not have survived the South. There's no doubt in my mind. Our survival depended upon those three parts: family, church, school. It struck me when I came to New York that something was missing up north. I did not see evidence of the strength of that, and especially in terms of family. I didn't see that. Another thing I didn't see, in the South I grew up where people emphasize, you must own your home. I got to New York and everybody was renting. I said, whoa, something is wrong with this picture. It was not like what I grew up with, right? The institution of work, the institution of labor. When I grew up in the South, people got up in the morning and they had a place to go to. There was no such thing as people hanging around the house all day reading comic books. You got up in the morning and you had to go somewhere. You had to go to work, whatever that work might be, or at times, however demeaning that work might be. People had a place to go to. You know what a difference this means upon kids growing up with a family situation where the parents actually has to get up and has a responsibility to go somewhere? They're not at home watching TV in their bathrobes all day. They're not accepting handouts. It makes a big difference on the kid growing up. So that institution of family, you know, it was the survival. It depended upon that.
I want to ask you about, I mean, we'll move to some imagery in a minute because we're leading up to the period at which you sort of arrive and start really making your first mature work. But I want to talk a little bit or ask you a little bit about the transition from the family that you just mentioned in terms of the South, and certainly the presence of the segregated South and places you were not allowed to be and places that were, you know, somewhat restricted from you. Your experience coming to New York and walking into another family that you would form, which was the artistic community, but also I want you to talk a little bit about the transition from the South to New York in terms of race.
I came to New York in the summer months when I was a student at Tuskegee. I would come here in the summer months. I would come to New York in the summer months to work. I would always have jobs lined up in the summer to make enough money to go back to college. But I came for good in 1960 to enter Cooper Union. Upon entering Cooper Union, this was the first time that I had been in a classroom with white people, with students. First time in a situation where I have a white instructor. And there's one person's name that I must mention in this connection. I hope you know the painter Robert Wathme, Southerner. Wathme was my first drawing instructor at Cooper Union. And Wathme, being a Southerner, was my main transition. I almost developed an inferiority complex because people could not understand what I would say. No one understood me. But Wathme did. So when Wathme and I would get into our groove, the rest of the students would just fall back like, wow, what are these people talking about? But Wathme eased my transition. He did. And do you know that today I know that his instructions, Wathme always insisted upon this connections, joints. He would point out, this is a wrist, things stop there. This is an elbow, something stops there. That was my first time that someone was pointing out to me the notion of the unit, a part. That's directly related to my thinking, what I'm doing today. Of course, the thing in the South in terms of segregation was painful. There's no doubt about it. I have some good memories, but, you know, I have some horrible memories that I don't even feel comfortable about talking in public. And why should I? I've always tried to lead my life in such a way that I deal with the now. I insist upon living in the now. I do not live in the past. I insist upon this. If I were to dwell upon things in my memory that I experienced in the South, I can't afford to carry that baggage.
Well, on the one, I mean, part of the reason I'm asking you, of course, is, and we've known each other for a long time. I know on the one hand that it made a great impression on you when you came out into New York from this experience here and could walk into the Cedar Bar and, for example, meet Bill de Kooning and Franz Klein and feel no issue in terms of color.
Right.
And so from that standpoint, we've got friends here from Birmingham, and just by virtue of talking a little bit about some, wonderful stories, the Birmingham Museum just made a purchase of a painting of yours that's in our show. You guys will see it when you come. And so, part of the magic of that, other than it being a fabulous painting that's now in a local, area collection, is that this was a museum you couldn't go to as a child.
That's correct.
But you could go to New York City and walk up into MoMA and go look at Cézanne's Bather, for example.
Right.
And so I'm
first time I've been into a museum.
So I'm interested in that notion of you coming to New York and meeting these people and having this access.
When I met people like Bill de Kooning, Franz Klein, Philip Guston, Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, I got a feeling that this was something that I wanted to be a part of. Even though I had spent almost a full year at Southern University as an art student, I had no connection with this greater community, which was known as art. In meeting these people, and just seeing the way that they move, their lifestyles, the way they talk, these people didn't have any hang-ups racially. So I started putting two two things together. As we say today, connecting the dots, we use the phrase, which is into the culture. I say, if this is art, then I want to be a part of this. Immediately, I felt a sense of freedom that I had never experienced before. I wasn't used to that. I wasn't used to white people. You know, Bill Cooney would come up and hit you on the shoulder and say, hey, kid, what's happening? You know, are you working? Did you do some work today? That kind of thing. I had nobody talk to me. I mean, my experience was, you know, get the fuck out of the way, sort of. So this made an impression upon me. And there was a reason. Then I started feeling, well, wow, there's a reason that I am here. I need this. I often acquaint that experience of coming to New York with jazz, you know. I very soon find out that jazz is a philosophy. It's a philosophy. The philosophy of jazz starts with the notion of the expansion of freedom. That's what it's about. So I could identify with that. And I felt meeting these people and being accepted like that, that I'm experiencing the expansion of freedom. So I had something to go on. So, of course, coming from the South, the buzzword was freedom. It's like when I first met Martin Luther King, you know. I remember going up, shaking his hand, speaking briefly. Hey, it made an impact on me. It gave me something to live for. Again, that expansion of freedom. When the man opened up his mouth, you believe him. You believe that this is possible. The confirmation of way people taught me or treated me, it helped my thinking. And the main thing, philosophically, it expanded my notion of freedom.
All right, well, let's look at some images and see where that freedom went. I think, I'm not sure what we'll deal with the lights, but we'll just try to look at some images. And I've got titles here. We're looking at a work from 1967, and I'll do all the sort of information about what we're looking at so you don't have to deal with it. This is New York Battleground. This was a work that was shown recently at a survey of Jack's work from the 1960s at PS1 in New York. Now, you mentioned de Kooning. I mean, there are so many stories, and we're going to fast track this because we're trying to fill in a lot of information. But certainly, when you've used the phrase abstract expressionism was your academy.
Yes.
And in that regard, the notion of painting, action, gesture, this is a work that certainly has a relationship to that history. And maybe you can talk a little bit about your work in the late 60s and this particular body of work.
I was attracted to the plasticity that informs abstract expressionism. And at the time that I was at Cooper Union, my education in art started off, it had a two-pronged approach. I actually studied with Hans Beckmann, German Bauhaus member that later came to New York and taught at Cooper Union. So I had two disciplines to deal with. I had the influence of the Bauhaus, and I had abstract expressionism. My heart was in abstract expressionism, the plasticity of it, the freedom of it, the thought of it, the gesture of it, everything about it, the lifestyle of it. Here is a painting, 1967, New York Battleground. The height of the Vietnam War is raging. The civil rights movement is reaching its peak. The violence that was occurring across America at that time all feeds this painting. All of the imagery you're having here is things that I'm working with as a young man, trying to get the grips on things about what's going on. What must I do to try to make sense of this? How can I preserve my sanctity in what was happening? If all of you reflect back to the late 60s, and those of you who were here and experienced that, you know the intensity of that period. And in New York, with the young artists on the Lower East Side, it was unmistakable. It was a driving force. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of violence in this, lots of violence. This organic, mechanical, helicopter-like. We're seeing those photos coming from Vietnam of Apache helicopters attacking people. We're seeing photos from My Lai of people being burnt by napalm. You know, horrific things. So all of that is feeding this, not to even mention what was happening here in the cities and approaching that period where we had 3 assassinations in one
And you're not depicting it, you're trying to come at it through gesture, through color, through the
I'm
materials.
doing the best I can. This is what I was attracted to. This is why I use the notion of abstract expressionism as my academy. This is what I knew. This is what I could do.
Right.
I couldn't be a classical painting in the French tradition at that time. I had to do what I was capable of doing, and what I knew was gesture.
Let's look at a painting from 1968. We're looking at USA Oracle, in parentheses, assassination of Martin Luther King. I'm sorry? These are paintings around 60 by 83, 50 by 50.
First, I must say that there's a whole series of paintings on Martin Luther King. It must be total, I would say, 10 of those paintings. Somewhere, about 10 of them, dealing with his life.
Dealing with his life prior to his death.
Yes, it started way before his death. But something was building up. Like this painting, USA Oracle, actually occurred before the assassination. I've had this to happen more than once in my experience as a painter. Things that happen that gives me all the clues of what to happen. And this occurred before. You have the painting in the show at the Contemporary, which is also the assassination, but it occurred afterwards, the assassination. This one occurred before.
Yeah. We're going to look at another painting called Conversation Piece from 67, where you're working in a figurative tradition. It's clear there are sort of figurative fragments in these works.
Yes.
But they're sort of hovering in space. The space is a very fluid space.
And all about faces. Something happened to me 1964, late 64. I started seeing images in everything that I looked at, on the floor, at the bar, on the counter, anything. I started seeing these images. And when I was painting, these images would burst forth out of the paint. It caused a lot of problems to it. It really bothered me.
Are we talking about psychedelics, or are we talking about imagery?
Oh, yeah.
Or both?
Well, when you're experiencing this type of imagery that's bursting forth from the paint, the human mind, we want to make sense of what we do. If we cannot make sense of what we do, it becomes very uncomfortable.
But
Our level of anxiety.
But you're also looking at, I mean, at this point in time, you're looking at surrealism, you're reading, I mean, so the notion of imagery coming out of materials is something you would have, regardless of what you may or may not have been seeing, you're also aware of that tradition.
Oh, I'm very much aware of André Masson. I'm very much aware of Wilfredo Lamb. By this point, I've seen a lot of Tapiers. I have seen a lot of Mata, the South American. I know all of Gorky. By then, I have dissected Gorky. My first art deal in New York was Alan Stone. Alan picked me up in 1965, and Alan Stone was a great collector of Ashley Gorky's work. And there I had the opportunity to literally pick up drawings. Alan owned a lot of those Gorky drawings. So I studied that. You better believe it. I had a very beautiful background in surrealism and the organic side of surrealism. Surrealism comes in 2 big schools of thought. We have the similars and we have the organics. My attraction is more to the organics. Not that I didn't admire someone like Tanguy or Ernst. Or Ernst, but it was the organic. My man was Wilfredo Lamb. My man was André Masson, Mata, Gorky. Those are the people that attracted me. I'm very much aware and I'm very much clear of the history of painting that I come out of.
Well, we'll get at this notion of, you know, your attack, interest, exploration of painting, and something you've insisted on. We're going to make a radical shift now, people, so get prepared. Imagery is gone of a certain figurative sense, and now we're looking at a series of drawings called Liquid Space, a series of them, 3 or 4 of them. These are on paper, acrylic slip, and we're going to start to get into a period.
Stuart, I'll have to give a brief background so they
can
follow the transition. I'll do it very quickly, as concise as possible. At the end of 1969, I realized that there was something missing in my thinking about painting. And I also realized that I had to do something to break the influence of Bill de Kooning on my hand. My hand was trained in abstract expressionist gesture, so I had to make a move. I made a conceptual move in 1970 to break de Kooning's hold. And I made the decision I got to find out more about this stuff called paint. So I started a whole series of experimentation. That's what started this. This is an early paperwork.
It's interesting. I don't know how many people were at, maybe now 2 years ago when Jeff Grove was doing an interview with Chuck Close, when Chuck was here for his show, and Chuck now being one of any number of painters of a certain generation who have all talked about trying to make a move to get away from the influence of Bill de Kooning. Chuck talked about it, Jack talks about it. There are whole careers that somehow never got away from that influence, but you made a series of moves to remove your hand or to do things that took gesture in another direction. These drawings are a good example of it.
Yeah, and all due respect to Chuck, for me it was even more one of necessity because I had a personal relationship to the man. Chuck didn't know de Kooning. As he said to me once, oh yeah, I knew him in my studio. Sure. So I had to break a love affair. Different story.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about the nature of how these drawings are made? Because there are paintings of the same period. We'll look at some of those that just start to use what you term, developers, tools that would extend your hand.
Right. Museum of Modern Art just purchased these drawings, worked on paintings from that period. They're from the early 70s. And it's a good example of how I'm advancing the organic side of surrealism, but more through process. They are made with a formula that I devised. I referred to it as acrylic slip. It was a very thin, transparent acrylic with a suspension of silica, graphite, little lamp black, aluminum bronzing powder. I'm using the fact that when paper is wet, extremely wet, it tends to warp and do things. So I'm applying this acrylic slip, and I have a large squeegee-like device that I'm raking the paint across. I can't even call it a paint. I have to call it a suspension. It's a very thin, transparent layer. Mm-hmm. So what's going on, I'm using the fact that the painting warps, and I'm using that to develop form.
Now, this is also, we're looking at a series of these drawings. This is also, this is 76, 77. This is after Xerox?
After Xerox.
Okay, because one of the things that's been quite interesting in Jack's development is a residency with the Xerox Corporation up in upstate New York.
Yeah.
And working with toner and working with materials and early flatbed, the earliest of the Xerox machines, and starting to get a handle on powder and other forms of sort of using things that really are sort of becoming trapped in a way.
Xerox Corporation invited myself and 4 artists. I think they gave us $5,000 apiece. They invited us up to their plant in Rochester, and they said, all we want you to do is play with our equipment and interact with our engineers and see what you come up with. It was a nice thing. Somebody offer you some cash money and tell you to play. Hey, man, it doesn't get any sweeter than that. And after we spent time up there, they said to me, you can take any of this equipment back to your studio. I took a mass of stuff back. But what I fell in love with was the toner. All of you know Xerox process. It's a dry printing process. It depends upon a powder, a dry powder called toner. By the way, it comes from the Greek word zero, which means dry. And I fell in love with the most sensitive thing. And I did so many experimentations with Xerox toner. And that helped me a lot into understanding what I had to do, okay? And I have to mention at this point, it was the first time I read the first edition of the Swedish mathematician Benno Mandelbrot, his first edition on fractal geometry. And when I read that, it gave me a whole nother basis to work with organic matter, organic form, because what Mandelbrot teaches with his fractal is that fractal is geometry. Now, my background in science at Tuskegee, I knew a lot about Euclidean-based geometries, but no one had even suggested that organic stuff could be thought of as geometry. And, Malebranche had the formulas to prove it. This was mathematics. So that helped me tremendously, that I had something that I could deal with, not only as a psychological factor, and that's how we dealt with it. Mm-hmm. We, as artists, dealt with the organic matter purely upon psychological terms. We even, because of Freud and Jung, and all of us who grew up reading those books of Jung's and Freud, Jung's book on symbol, the notion of the unconscious, this stuff fed artists. But this was the first time I could get my hand on something that was not dependent upon psychological factors, that it could be used as geometry. So Benoît Malebranche helped me a lot. He gave me something to work with.
Well, one of the things that we're going to see in these drawings, and maybe another one here, no, painting Prime Mover, this is a painting, oh no, it's not.
That's Omelos.
It's Omelos, right.
Yes.
And I'm coming up to it. But
yes. We're up to 1975 now, I would think.
74, but
74.
You're close.
Yeah.
But we're dealing with, again, what you talked about as making a painting whose entire plane, to go back to your early comment, in one gesture. The plane is a line. You're making these paintings like in one shot.
Right.
You're setting up a series of steps.
Yeah.
And in a way, going back to your mentioning about Tuskegee, the idea in a way that your studio is now a sort of lab. Yeah. Where you experiment.
Yeah. I realized that if I could do a painting that depended upon non-relational thought, all painting up to that point has been relational, meaning that the artist's use of gesture, the hand always comes up and moves from one point to another point. We know that. We know it from Kandinsky, was the first guy to start writing about points and systems and lines. All of abstract expressionism continued to be relational thought. So I figured if I could come up with a device for non-relational thinking, I could get around Bill de Kooning.
Because it's not this and that and that,
exactly.
It's that.
Exactly.
Okay, let's look
so
at
I conceived of the whole plane being one gesture, and that's what's happening here.
And notions of chance are factoring into it, like things you're putting under the painting, things that you're...
I'm controlling all the devices in terms of form by placing things beneath the canvas. The previous painting is Omelos. Omelos is a beach on the south coast of the island of Crete, where I've lived for the past 40 years. And it was a beach that I would go to fish, and they had a black volcanic stone there, pebble, and I brought a bunch of those pebbles back to New York. And Omelos was built with those pebbles. They were placed strategically beneath the canvas, and when the acrylic was poured down and my developer was used to rake across, the stones dictated the nature of the shapes.
Right, so they're interruptions. If it's not already clear, these are works that are being made on the floor, right? They're being made on a big drawing platform, large squeegee, one shot. They obviously have to be made flat because they're happening wet. We'll look at a couple of others. These are the paintings that for people in the audience who are quite up on contemporary painting, and if you visited upstairs, the permanent collection, you know work by the German painter Gerhard Richter. These are paintings that Jack has made in the mid-'70s, late '70s. They predate Richter's experiences with painting of this sort by at least a decade or so. And this is a body of work that's getting quite a lot of attention now, because as the works are getting more well-known, not just in the States, these were paintings shown at the Whitney in a solo show in 1974, so they were not, unknown, but at the same time you're showing now more in Europe and elsewhere, and there is this kind of giant question mark when people start to look at this work from the mid-'70s, and it does a funny registering in their head.
Well, I had a German to say to me recently, he comes up to me, in all due respect, he says to me, "How is this possible?"
Yeah. What did you call it today? You're the fly in the soup? Is that what you said today? The fly in the soup in terms of the art history aspect of this?
Yeah. I'm the fly in the soup.
So
let's stir it, baby.
So obviously these are paintings with tremendous surface incident, amazing sort of color, very unpredictable color. I think quite, kind of amazingly beautiful. This is from the period during which the Birmingham painting is from. that painting in our show called Black Table Setting for Duke Ellington.
Yes. Siberian salt grinder.
This is a painting that has maybe one of the great titles of all time, Siberian Salt Grinder. And I have not met a single person who can explain what that means, and they don't want to know. It's just too fun to chew on as a title. How do you deal with titles? I never asked you this.
I could say what it is if people
Don't do it.
are interested. It's a political painting. We're in the height of the Cold War. Stories are coming out about the Gulag and what was happening in Russia and people being sent to Siberia, political prisoners. I saw myself as a political prisoner in New York City in the mid-'70s. You gather?
I do.
I'm the salt grinder. But it's happening in Manhattan. It's not happening in Siberia.
There's a painting called Prime Mover. Same period. Excellent painting.
Yeah.
Again,
Here I'm placing wire, pieces of coat hanger beneath the canvas, pebbles. Occasionally a little piece of geometrical figure might be placed beneath. Anything that I could do to break the plane and break the action in order to create form happening inside of the all-over structure of the picture plane.
So a certain amount is controlled, a certain amount is serendipity.
Well, hey, it's a conceptualized form of gambling. Now, those of you who understand gambling, if you can come up with a way to conceptualize your odds, hey, baby, you're doing pretty good.
So this is 1974. This is the Whitney Museum. And I see by the presence of Sarah, I need to speed this up. This is 1974. It's the show that Marcia Tucker, who was then curator at the Whitney, organized. And here's probably, as we say, the money shot, which is, or not, on the way to the money shot. Yeah. That's the money shot.
That gives you an idea of the tool that I had devised to make these paintings.
So when he's saying he's trying to get away from his hand, he's going a fair length to do it.
Yes. That thing was so big, I had it on wheels to maneuver it in position. It was made from a big T-frame sort of a thing.
Okay. We could go on and on. I'm going to speed this up a little bit. And so we're dealing now with the extension of paintings. If your early developer, the one we just saw, was a giant squeegee with squeegee-like edge, rubber, something that would move the paint fluidly. This is a series of paintings, roughly that same slightly later period, where you're using other things, notched metal, yes. Other developers, afro combs,
the
things
developer
to move
went
the paint.
through 3 or 4 separate things. At first it was a piece of 2x4. Second, it was a piece of rubber attached to the 2x4. Third, it was a sheet of 16-gauge sheet metal. And then fourth, I started cutting notches into the sheet metal, a lot of experimentations with increments of sizes, 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch, 3/8 of an inch. And I finally settled upon this, which is cut at 1/8 of an inch.
And 1/8 of an inch will give you, I mean, for people who see these, I don't know what it's doing out there, but when you look at one of these up close, there's one hanging at MoMA in New York right now. It is intensely optical, very hard to pin down visually in terms of what you're looking at. And is that 1/8 of an inch that's doing that buzz,
At 1/8 of an
right?
inch, it gave me exactly what I wanted. There was a lot of experimentations, though.
Okay.
This occurs after the 70s.
Right. We're moving into late 70s, early 80s.
1980. Right.
This is a series of works that Henry Geldzaler, the curator formerly of the Met and many other places, cultural ambassador at New York, organized for you at the Studio Museum, curated at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 1980.
That's Dead Reckoning. And I must say that it was the first time after 10 years that I could do a painting standing upright. It was a great feeling. It was a great feeling to come up off the platform that I had built, and I could actually stand up to make a painting.
And much of these geometries are incised into the paint, right?
Yes, it's cut into wet acrylic.
Okay.
The whole thing is highly conceptualized. You have to lay it out. You have to know. You have to have a map. I have a map that tells me exactly where the color is. And when I cut through there, it reveals the color.
Yeah. And a lot of the things that you're doing with this are coming out of tools that you're either making or using from your experience in the construction trade. So
that's correct.
This is something we need to sort of flush out. It's just very briefly the idea that Jack is in effect making a painting as opposed to painting it. This comes up a lot in discussions of his work. I mean, the idea that he's setting up systems which allow him to sort of make the thing more so than painting it with a traditional brush.
I don't even use the verb to paint. It's always to make.
Okay.
This is with my
we're
dear
going to try to, I mean, we've got a lot of material to cover, and we're going to do it, Sarah, really quickly. This is Jack and Romeo Bearden. This is at your show in '83 at Onyx Gallery.
Yes.
And we're now going to move into, hopefully, a little bit more of the discussion of some of the work that is at the Contemporary, but also this is a painting dedicated to Romeo Bearden called I Remember Romy. I'm not going to spend a ton of time showing you pictures that you can go see in the flesh. So I would just encourage you to, you know,
those paintings
come
are
on
here
over.
in Atlanta now.
But I do want to talk a little bit and ask you a little bit about the notion of this notion of paying tribute, certainly. The people that you're making paintings for, and we're looking here.
Oh, that's Monk's painting.
Painting called, what are we dealing with? This is Brilliant Corners. What is this?
That's Brilliant Corners.
Brilliant Corners.
Thelonious Monk.
For Thelonious Monk. A lot of paintings, I mean, I guess by way of talking about the memorials, all of these paintings that you have made that are dedicated to people, for the most part, with very few exceptions, these are people that you knew quite well. They're in the arts community, jazz community, literature community, occasionally politics.
I would hang out at the old Phi Spot. I used to sit at Monk's feet. I would sit at his feet. This is around midnight.
We're looking at Flying High for Betty Carter.
Yes, someone I admired dearly. Hey, Betty. Betty Carter. Fantastic lady.
This is Black Monolith for Barbara Jordan.
Barbara Jordan, another fantastic lady.
Can you talk a little bit, because this is really critical, can you talk a little bit about the notion of, and because obviously you're seeing folks in the audience, that the quality of the picture is changing. We've just gone from a major issue of speed, where the painting is being made in a moment, to paintings which are laboriously built with little chips of acrylic, what Jack calls tessera, sort of working on the history of mosaic, where he's literally making the paint, cutting it up into these bite-sized units, and then, again, constructing the painting. Can you talk just a little bit about the alliance between your subjects and your materials? Because it's a critical issue.
I know we have to move on a little rapidly here. You know, I've had a lot of experience in the Mediterranean basin, all through Italy, from one end to the other. I mean, the years I've spent on Crete, and I've had profound interest in the Byzantine world. And I recognized that there was a connection there with mosaics and what's happening in modern technology, the bit. I sincerely believe that all of modernist theory ends with some notion of the bit. I was upstairs the last time I was here. You have some beautiful Kellys up there. I understand the Kelly as a bit. It's a unit. I understand the Judds as a unit.
Alfred Jensen, we were talking about.
Is a unit, right? I'm making a statement that second phase modernism ends with the unit. That's what we were searching for. It's a sort of a holy grail. That's why the necessity of minimalism was so acute. Someone had to do that. Someone had to cut it down to that final analysis. Of course, this is all related directly to the atomic world in which we live in. You know, scientists has been searching this stuff for a long time. There's no doubt in my mind that what's been happening in the arts is directly parallel with what's happening in particle physics. It's the same thing, but it's on a different plane.
Yeah. Well, and you've talked about that notion of the mosaic, what you know, the tessera, the bit. You're making it, you're constructing the paint, you're infusing the paint, you're creating, in effect, a dry palette. But you've talked about that thing, that bit, as in a way the legacy of Cézanne's brushstroke,
oh, yeah.
the computer chip, the pixel, all of those kinds of histories, from art to science to philosophy, the nature of a unit, fractals, any one of those things contains a kind of picture of the whole, right? So we're going to do, this is a painting for Stanley Kubrick.
No.
No, it's not. This is El Nino, sorry.
That's
for Charlie Parker.
Yeah, El Nino, extremely lyrical, extremely high-pitched, bebop-ish.
That's Stanley Kubrick.
That's Stanley's painting. Jacob Lawrence,
Black monolith for Jacob Lawrence.
the guy helped me so much, so dear to my thinking. I speak often of plasticity. Jake insisted whenever we spoke, keep it plastic, man. Maintain the structure of it. He was a great... See, people don't talk about Bearden or Lawrence in the sense of structure. That's why next week in New York City, I've been invited to give a talk at the Romare Bearden Foundation. And what they want me to do is to speak specifically of the structure in a Romare Bearden painting. They have a show up there now. I'm very quite honored to do this because in all of the writings, everyone points out the story, which is important, the psychology, the culture, all of that's important. But even more important is the structure of what's going on. So that's what I'm going to address that talk to next week.
This is a painting dedicated to your brother Billy, who passed, called Little Bo Peep, E-Stamp. But again, talking about technology and science and influence of imagery.
Coding.
This is a coding.
Yep.
This is a series of works. We'll look at another one. This is a painting that's going to be on the cover of our upcoming catalog for Jack. Another E-Stamp painting dedicated to Bobby Short. And again, do people know what an E-Stamp is?
It's data glyphs. You know data glyphs?
When you print out a pre-coded stamp off your computer, it's like pre-printed on the envelope that you can print. You don't need a physical stamp. Those codes, and Jack, recently you've been working with things like e-stamps, barcodes, coded information that sits between the photographic, the real, the daily. So in a way, this is sort of pop art paintings, I might even venture to say, although I wouldn't think about them that way.
Well, they're embedded in our culture contemporarily.
This is a painting dedicated to Marcia Tucker. This is over at the Contemporary.
Al Loving's.
Painting dedicated to Al Loving. Al Held.
Yes.
I'm going to stop doing this. We'll start getting into an old vaudeville routine. This is an installation of some of those paintings over at the Alexander Gray Gallery in Chelsea, your most recent show in New York. And I guess, are we all right for the minute? Okay. We're ending with the sort of kitchen sink painting. In a way, when you were here last, you said this is a painting that's called 9/11/01. It's a painting not unlike all of the other memorial paintings. It's a painting dedicated to the events of 9/11, which you were unfortunately a very close witness to. You want to talk a little, this is a very big subject, very big story, very big painting, but maybe you can talk a little bit about
we'll speed it up as best I can without losing too much of the essence of it. The 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, and entering 2000 is all in this painting. There's close to 45 years of knowledge that went in producing this painting. I could not have done this painting without the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. Everything that I knew about painting goes into here. I was in the street the morning of 9/11. My home and studio at that time was at Lisbonard and Church Street. When the firemen came that morning, as always, when I hear fire trucks, I would go downstairs and see what was going on. And someone had reported a gas leak. There was a young Frenchman that was doing a documentary film on the fire department. His camera was down into the manhole cover. When all of a sudden we heard a noise, the best way I can describe this noise, that it was so deafening, you actually felt your skin moving. It was that type of a noise. And all of us automatically looked upward. The young Frenchman swung his camera upward, and we looked up just in time to see the first plane hit the North Tower. The first thing you saw was this burst of glass. And I'm sure all of you have seen that first video over and over. And there's a voice on that video which says, "Holy shit!" That's me. That was my reaction. That's what came out. It was horrific. I've said before, I hate to admit that the first burst of glass was the most fantastic thing I've ever seen in my life. It was a sublime experience. New York was extremely clear, perfectly blue sky, and the glass, before the smoke, before the flame, the first you saw was a chandelier of glass that just filled the air. And then afterwards, you saw this big gaping hole with the smoke and the fire. And I was arguing with the fireman. The captain says to me, "What a horrible accident." And I looked at him straight in the face and I said, "Man, that was no accident." And he actually became angry. "What do you mean? You saw what I saw. It was an accident." I said, "Man, that was no accident." Now, the only basis I had for saying that was a pure gut reaction to what I had witnessed. It was no accident. The firemen immediately jumped into their cars and headed south toward the towers. I continued to argue with my tenant, the pizza guy, about whether it was an accident or not. And we got into a heated argument. Then the second plane hits. And then I looked at him and I said, "You still think it's an accident?" At that point, we didn't know what was going on. And then, people jumping out of the buildings. It was a horrific thing to witness. I hope to God that I never witness something like that again.
Well, you also made a point. I mean, there was a lot of discussion after 9/11 about whether or not any good art could ever come out of that, whether it was just sort of not unlike a Holocaust. Like, how are you going to make an art that's going to try to sum up or deal with or acknowledge the power of that sort of day? And I think, a lot of people would have been incredibly fearful of even trying to take this kind of subject on. But in conversation with you, you also mentioned that you saw the building of the towers go up. So in the early 70s, you're not only watching its collapse in 2001, yes, you're watching its emergence in your neighborhood.
Yeah.
And so this is a painting that it's 10 by 20 feet?
10 feet by 20 feet. I moved to Tribeca in 1962. So what that means, I saw the first bulldozers that went down to start digging the foundation. I saw it go up step by step, and I saw it come down step by step.
So this painting was shown recently with some of the paintings that you first saw, the New York Battleground, some of those very violent pictures, gestural abstract paintings from the late 60s at PS1. This painting is certainly the centerpiece of our show over at the Contemporary. And I guess, by way of talk, you've got that crystalline glass burst of blue up there. You've also got this very ominous black bloodied triangle pyramid. Can you talk just a little bit about the genesis of how that picture came about, and then we'll move on to some other questions?
Briefly, the pyramid shape, I took it from our dollar bill because I was working with three symbolic factors: blood, money, and petroleum. It's about power. This is a history painting. Best way to describe this painting is a history painting. It's over a gallon of blood in that painting. I've been experimenting with blood in acrylic since early 90s, and I have found that it holds. The acrylic preserves it. There's a lot of bone fragment. There's a lot of silica. There's a lot of rust. There's a lot of copper. There's a lot of debris, like things from the 80s when I was making molds of things, because what I saw, the aftermath, you saw everything in that pile of muck imaginable. Everything. Squashed cars. I saw fire trucks literally reduced to pancakes. Rust material. So all of that went into that painting. And of course the missiles. We had 4 hits. And I have that. Now, I ran a risk as an abstract painter doing this painting. I knew that from the beginning. How far can I take abstraction and stretch it into a literal narrative account of an experience? I realized I was taking a risk. But I built this painting with the intention that I wanted this painting to relate to the average person in the street. I believe, and it has been proven to me by showing this painting, one does not need a knowledge of art history. One does not need a knowledge of painting and the history of painting to understand this painting. This painting has been proven over and over to affect the gut. That's what I wanted. It shows the power of abstraction. I'm a believer in abstract painting. And especially now, entering the 21st century, I go as far to say that it's abstraction that will make its mark. So I have placed all of my faith in abstract painting.
Well, and a lot of the experience of having people, including, we had 30 school children from Tennessee who I spent an hour with looking at this painting without telling them anything about 9/11 and just talking to them about what they saw. Their feedback just went right into the content. Their description just of what they were looking at, the materials, the feelings they were having. Over and over again over at the Contemporary, we give a tour, people come in, they have been leaving incredibly moved, and they don't know exactly why in some cases. They don't know maybe about James Baldwin, but they have a sense looking at this painting, they're picking up on something, and it's coming through the materials. And this is something that you've been saying for years, is that the paint itself, the materials, is what's delivering that.
I'm what is called a matter painter. We deal with matter. In matter, the idea is to infuse paint as matter through symbol is infused into the material. That's what matter painters do. There's a whole history of matter painting.
All right, I have a million more questions, but I'm going to turn over the pleasure to the audience a little bit and ask. There's probably time for a couple of questions, and we would love to hear anything that's on your mind that Jack can address or I can address.
Yes, and if you wait for the mic, we're recording, so thank you.
On the last painting, 9/11, I can't help but look in the background. It looked like it was the memorial, the Vietnam Memorial. Was that something you intended?
You'll have to help me with the translation because of my hearing.
He's talking about the early Vietnam painting?
I was thinking in the background of the last 9/11 on one painting, the sky, it looked to me like the Vietnam Memorial. And I was thinking
the Vietnam Memorial in D.C., you mean?
In D.C., exactly.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So was that...
Talking about relating the 9/11 painting, the background of it, the mosaic, obviously, aspect of it, to Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial.
I would accept that. I had never thought of that. But since you pointed it out,
actually, I would pick up just for a quick second on what you're saying. I've been thinking a lot about memorials, obviously, given the nature of the exhibition, and writing about the show. If you think about the Vietnam Memorial, and I've just been looking at it, I haven't had the pleasure of seeing the Berlin Memorial to the Holocaust, which is also, it's Peter Eisenman. Some of the most powerful experiences for people in this notion of memorial are not representational. They're abstract. They're coming through materials. You enter into that. I mean, Maya Lin's very clear. You walk down into the ground. The Eisenman piece, you physically adjust yourself to all of these repeated plinths, Yeah. And I found it very interesting that some more I start to think about that notion that a lot of the power is coming through materials.
You have a good eye. Thank you.
Repetition. Other questions?
Jack, you mentioned something about how you really like to deal with the here and now and looking towards the future. But yet you did this whole series of work about memory, about memorials, and tell me how you kind of reconcile the two concepts together.
I've traveled a lot. I've had the opportunity to travel a lot. And one thing that I've noticed wherever I go in the world, one of the best judge, if you want to use to evaluate cultures, is how they treated their dead. It's one of the best judges, right? You go into these places and you discover how they treated their dead, how that they honor them, how that they bury them. I've been to a lot of burial sites. I've been to tombs, ancient tombs, lots of different places. And I realized that we have to recognize the past, that the past makes us who we are. But I have a belief that I refuse to wallow in the past. I don't accept that. It's even my African background. I've done a lot of study on African art, and I'm a wood carver. I started carving wood back in the early 60s in order to get my hands on the nature of the forms of African wood carving, and that has taught me a lot. And I realize my history there, but I'm not going to wallow in that history. So I use the past to inform who I am today, and I can project upon that. I don't waste time over stuff that I can't control. People often ask me about my identity as a black man in the South in terms of how I look. I'm not responsible for the way I look. It's not my responsibility. We all know the history of that, but I'm not going to waste time on that. But I will take that past and the knowledge of the past and use it to the best of my knowledge to construct what I want to be. It's that kind of a thing.
You also recently, just a quick aside to that, because at MoMA recently, when you did a talk recently, you talked about, and it was really good to see you talk about this because it was so joy-producing. You talked about being able to, for the first time really in your life, look at this legacy from Bearden and Lawrence to yourself, to Kara Walker, to Mark Bradford. Could you talk a little bit about that just for a second? Because it's at the edge of this notion of paying tribute and memory that J.D. brings up.
Yeah. Well, we in the African American community, people have to understand, we have a history. And when it comes to the visual arts, we have an extremely rich history. I remember early on certain forms of critique of shows that I've done and friends of mine where the person who were doing the critique would always try to link it in such a way that, oh, it's influenced by some blah, 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 blah. The person that they're talking about is always a white artist that's influenced by. If one knows the history of African American culture, African American art, the visual arts in particular, we know that in that history there's a continuum that feeds us. We have a community in the arts. I am very much aware of that history, and I have been lucky that I've met a lot of those people while they were alive that have informed my thinking. So in that respect, okay, what's happening in the black community today in the arts, all of us should be clapping our hands. We, as black artists, are covering every possible mode of aesthetics. We, as black people, are multi-dimensional people. We have an aesthetic that covers multiple levels of thought. There is no one singularity that defines who we are as a people. It's multi-level. So that informs me, especially in terms of abstraction. So I have lived long enough that I applaud what's happening in the black community in the arts. You understand?
I do. You got another question?
I want to go back to something you said earlier about testimonials. And I'd like to understand a little bit better your connection between the idea of the testimonial and the memorial paintings. Because a testimonial isn't quite a memorial. So
no, it's not. No. The testimonial, as I understood it growing up in the Southern Church, we did not go to psychiatrists. First of all, we didn't have the money. First of all, there was no psychiatrist that would have been possibly available in a position to define the nature of our psyche. So the church was used. The church, in all due respect, in terms of its religious motivation, also served as a way for people to get, as my mother would call it, things off your chest. The testimony was, I stand before a group of people. It's important. When you stand before a group of people and there is something bothering your psyche, it forms a collective. And within the collective, all people share this. Within the collective, it helps to cure what ails us. This is extremely important. It's like funerals, for example. We bury someone, right? We have our rituals in terms of burial. We don't do that for the dead. We don't. We do it for ourselves. It's a means, in terms of grief, that is so strong, is so unbearable, that we share the grief. That's what funerals are about. When I testify, and I testify to what ails me and to my beliefs, I am sharing this. It's a collective. And everywhere I've gone in the world, people have this. It's an aspect of culture. It's not just unique to the South, but here in the South, because of the political situations, it became a very unique situation.
And you also,
of course, it's different from the memorial.
Yeah, but also the notion, I mean, you're also not only believing that that's something worth doing, you're also believing that painting is the mechanism to deliver it.
Well, yeah, I'm a painter.
Amongst other things that painting does.
I've had to make a lot of decisions in my life, you know, leaving the South when I did down in Baton Rouge. I participated in one of the leaders of a civil rights march in downtown Baton Rouge. Man, I witnessed some so horrific stuff in that march. I have every reason in the world to be a crazy man. I have had enough stuff to happen to me. I should be crazy, but I'm not. Why?
It would be a good place to end. That could be the quote. But actually, let's not, because I have one other thing I want to ask you. Just as a given, we mentioned Bob Rauschenberg. And in the spirit of the sort of memorial, Rauschenberg has an interesting, I'm curious for you to just talk about, A, did you know Rauschenberg? B, certainly the notion of collage, assemblage, many of the spirits that you work with and draw on are sort of embedded in Rauschenberg's sensibility. So I thought just sort of like in tribute to Bob, maybe we could just talk a little bit about Rauschenberg.
Well, first and foremost, we share the Southern sensibility. Bob often spoke of growing up in the South. As he said once, he says, hey, man, I grew up with a lot of junk around me. We all know what he means about this, at least all of us who grew up in the South. Like my community, for example, people have old stoves out in the backyard, sofas that they refuse to throw out in the front lawns. It's still there. Still there? So we are very much aware of this, right? And I was very much aware by this point of African art in terms of assemblage and three-dimensional notions of collage. But, you know, Bob's taking it and putting it in a contemporary frame. So I'm paying attention to Bob Rauschenberg. I'm saying, by jolly, if he can do that, then I got a basis for do that coming from another perspective. So Bob helped me a lot. I was afraid of him as a young man because of my experiences with alcohol in the South. I found that I couldn't spend a lot of time around Bob. There were certain habits there that I was afraid of. But in terms of the man's talent, I mean, he's a great artist. He's a great artist, and he has influenced a lot of people. And he uncovered a lot of stuff that all of us have to deal with. And me in particular got to deal with.
Let's end there. I want to thank everybody for coming. It's very special to have Jack here. It's a personal... It's a personal and professional pleasure for us. I would just say the show is up until June 15th. If you haven't had a chance to see it, please come and join us. We are now open on Sundays to make that even more available to you. And we will be probably in the next 3 weeks or so, hopefully, being able to deliver the first catalog we've produced in a very long time, which is the catalog that coincides with the exhibition. And it's just it's a wonderful moment for us, for the contemporary. I want to thank Jack. Thank you all.